Hi, I'm Maggie. Thank you for stopping by Crafts the Charm today. You are most welcome here. In some other videos, I've worked with these Dollar Tree vinyl bags to make pocketbooks, and I thought it would be fun for the spring to use the sort of pink colored bags and make a little backpack. Let's go have some fun. To make this bag, we're going to need 2 of the Dollar Tree vinyl bags, and we are going to take them completely apart. The straps or handles pop right off, but the crossbody strap will need to be removed by ripping the seams. We'll then rip the seams all the way down and also at the bottom so that we'll have a flat piece for each bag. So what we have when we're done with the process is the bags, which are roughly 10 by 10 inches on each side with the 1-inch bit in the middle, and then they do have those snaps, which we're not going to be using, and we also don't need to remove. And then we've got 4 of these hand straps, which are double-sided. They're finished on both sides, but the crossbody strap is only finished on one side. And we've got 2 of those, and they're quite long. They are about the same width. We're only going to use the crossbody straps for this project. So I was able to use a cool iron and iron all of the pieces, including the straps. So they come out quite nicely when they're ironed. Now this is my original plan of how to cut the pieces out for the project. And what I really didn't take into consideration was the holes that the shorter straps fit into right there. Those are roughly 1 inch in. So what I'm going to have to do is move everything over a little bit and move some pieces to the other bag in order to get everything cut out, and I will show you a new drawing of the second plan. This is my little prototype bag. The bottom is a 5 by 7 inch piece of vinyl, as are the front and back bottom pieces. On the sides, I didn't have enough vinyl for the prototype, but those are 5 by 5 inch pieces of vinyl from the bag. And then the top is 3 inches all the way around, 5 inches by 7 inches respectively for the sides and the front. Now I also want to have some piping up the sides of the bag and around the bottom. And so the piping's going to be 1 inch. And this is going to be a drawstring bag, and so this is me trying to figure out how to get that to work because the vinyl doesn't gather. But if we have a lining fabric on the inside that does gather, that will work, and the vinyl will gather up with the lining on the inside. I just wasn't really able to get it to gather all by itself, like vinyl on both sides. So the vinyl won't fold over into the inside of the bag, really. It will only be on the outside, and the lining on the inside will be used for the gathering. This part of the bag will be another fabric. Now, of course, you can buy fabric at the Dollar Tree if you want to make this completely a Dollar Tree project. I went to Joann's and I bought this. This is a sort of a stretchy fabric. I wanted a off-white corduroy, but they didn't have an off-white corduroy. So I bought this stretchy fabric. It was a half yard for about $5. And a half yard is about right for both the lining and for the middle pieces on the outside of the bag. Because it's not corduroy and it's not as heavy as I wanted, I am going to use somewhat heavy interfacing on it to give it some weight, to give it some body. So this is the interfacing that I'm going to use. And this is an iron-on interfacing. So I practiced to make sure the interfacing worked with that fabric, and it did. It worked great. And here's the new plan where I'm taking those holes into account, and I just moved that over an inch and then cut the other pieces out. You can see there's one on the other side, those 7 by 5 inch pieces, and there's one down below. Moved the 5 by 5 inch piece toward the middle, and I just fudged. The pieces are really more than 10 inches, but I just called that 10 inches because it's just a little extra, it doesn't matter. So you can hopefully see the measurements there, and I didn't figure out exactly the sizes of the piping that I'm going to need, but I know there's plenty of material over there to get the piping that we need. Now for the lining, we'll just have a 13 inch by 7 inch pieces for the front and back, 13 inch by 5 inch pieces for the two sides, and a 7 by 5 inch piece for the bottom. So that's quite simple. That will go together very quickly. And again, I'm assuming a 1/2 inch seam allowance. In practice, I end up using a smaller seam allowance than that. Now, if you use a fabric that's directional, like corduroy is, make sure you're always cutting it in the correct direction. This would be a typical sort of mistake that I would make sewing. Really tried to go slowly with this project and do it correctly. So I will be cutting the pieces for the front of the bag, which is 2 5 by 7 inch pieces and 2 5 by 5 inch pieces. And then I'll also be cutting the lining, which is 2 13 by 7 inch pieces, 2 13 by 5 inch pieces, and 1 7 by 5 inch piece. Once I have the pieces cut, then I can cut the interfacing and iron the interfacing to the pieces. And you do this with a damp press cloth or possibly with steam. I used a damp press cloth and it worked great. Now, I only added interfacing for the pieces that are going on the outside of the bag. I did not add interfacing to the lining pieces. The lining is soft. With all of the lining cut, we can now cut the vinyl for the bag, or of course you can do this in any order. And I am just going to follow the plan and cut out the pieces that are going to be the bottom of the bag and the top of the bag. So the 5 by 7 inch pieces for the bottom front, the 5 by 5 inch pieces for the bottom sides, and the 5 by 7 inch piece for the bottom of the bag that it will rest on. And then again, the top pieces are 3 inches by 7 inches for the front and back, and 3 inches by 5 inches for the sides, and those are taking into account a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And I didn't use the entire seam allowance, so my seam allowance is a little smaller. Now let's lay the pieces out and just get an idea of how this is going to look, see if we like the proportions. So there are a bottom and a top vinyl piece, and then a corduroy-ish, whatever this fabric is, piece will go between those. And this is the wider piece, so this is the front or back of the bag. Smaller pieces are the side of the bag. Now, I had created these bag tags in another video, and I thought that I would try one out on this bag. So I want it to have a little vinyl piece behind it. And what I'm going to do is stitch the vinyl piece down to the cream color, the off-white color front of the bag, with a decorative stitch, a 4.5 centimeter stitch. So you'll see with the bag tag it has 4 little prongs, and those prongs will need to go through both the vinyl and the corduroy-ish fabric behind. So I'm going to figure out where those prongs are and press them through, and then stitch the tag onto the fabric. And that way, when the bag is almost finished, before I put the lining in, I can put the tag through. So the tag won't be on the bag most of the time that I'm working on it, but I need to get this fabric ready for the tag for later. I'm cutting those holes for the prongs with a knife, and I found that what worked best for me for getting those holes in the right place was to use a Sharpie on the wrong side of this vinyl and mark exactly where they should go. Now I need to get the corduroy fabric marked in the correct place, and I had marked exactly where that tag should go before I took it off. And again, I pressed with the prongs. You can even see that on this video, that you can see where the marks are on the corduroy. So it was much easier for me just to use the marks that are there. That X-Acto mat is a little bit thicker than the Fiskars one that I cut my fabric on, so I like to use that one when I'm cutting with a knife. Now, because I have had difficulty getting the tension correct on my sewing machine for this vinyl, I did want to practice not only with the stitches, but also with turning and trying to get a nice crisp corner when I make that turn. So I'm just practicing on fabric that's the same width, so a little bit of vinyl over a little bit of corduroy, or my fake version of corduroy, before I do the actual bag tag vinyl on the front of the bag. And again, this is a 4.5 millimeter stitch. So it's a little wider than the stitching that I'm using to sew the pieces together. I decided to use a little masking tape to hold that down while I was sewing it, or at the start of sewing it, since there's nothing holding it together except the little metal bag tag, which I'm going to take out, obviously. And that's how that came out. The one corner was not great, the rest of it came out really well. So pretty good for me. And because you can't backstitch when you're sewing something decorative, I tied the threads together on the back. And now we're going to just start sewing the pieces of the bag together. So just sewing the bottom piece to the middle piece, and then we'll sew the middle piece to the top piece. And because you can actually iron this vinyl, I am going to just open it up and iron the seams flat. So I don't know if you can do that with other vinyls, but I find with these Dollar Tree vinyl bags, I think they iron pretty well as long as you use a cool iron and you're careful, keep checking. But so I intend to just sew it and then open it up and press the seam open. So once we have all these pieces, and I'm checking to make sure that they line up, and they actually do, which again is amazing for me, I'm going to make the piping. And I'm going to use 1-inch strips because I need enough for the seam allowance. So I don't want very much of it to show, but I need enough to be part of the seam. Now the total length of that is 11 inches. So it's going to be tricky to get 11 inches out of the bag, but I think I was able to eke out 4 1-inch by 11-inch strips for the piping or welting. And normally you would put some kind of cord inside the piping. I didn't think that was necessary because this vinyl is pretty thick. So you can see I've pressed the seams open, and what I'm going to do is sew the piping along the edge of each of the pieces of the bag. And those holes aren't going to matter because they're going to be inside. So I tried sewing it 2 ways. I tried just sewing it flat, and I tried sewing it folded over, and I found the folded over worked much better for putting the bag together. So I ended up stitching them all so that they were folded over before I sewed the bag together. So now with all the pieces of the bag having their piping, and I will sew those folded over before I sew them together, I just need to sew the pieces of the bag together. And the most critical thing here is making sure that the seams line up. So making sure that the white part is even. So that's where I concentrated on putting them together and not worrying so much if the top or the bottom was a little bit off, but making sure that that white part lines up, and then just sewed the seams. Now it's a little bit thick, you can see, so you might have to adjust the tension of your sewing machine. I think that in some places I ended up stitching it a couple of times to get it to work, even with adjusting the tension, and I may even have gone in and adjusted a little bit by hand. Now on the back of the bag, we're going to have straps to cinch the top of it tight. And so I'm going to need some way for those straps to come out of the bag. And I didn't want to use hardware. Now this is the crossbody strap from both of the bags. I'm going to sew those together so that it's finished on both sides, and so I get a nice long strap. And then what I thought I would do is just sew a couple of buttonholes in the back and have it come out of the buttonholes rather than worry about any sort of hardware. So I have the buttonhole foot for my machine, and I'll say, boy, did I learn a lot about my sewing machine, because I haven't sewn any buttonholes with this sewing machine before. And this is really a marvel of engineering here. So you put your button, in this case it's a strap, you put your button in there, you adjust that to the correct size, and then you just type the correct number for the kind of buttonhole that you want, and you position your foot at the bottom of the buttonhole, and then you just sew it and it sews the buttonhole. Now in theory, I practiced I don't know how many times to try to get this to work, and sometimes the machine would just decide it was done before it was done, and other times it just the tension was way off, and I tried I think all of the tensions. So what I found actually worked was sewing it on the wrong side of the fabric, and then you just cut down the middle. Now the trick, of course, with sewing two buttonholes is getting them to align, and I'd say mine mostly align, but I definitely could have done better. I didn't want to mark the fabric, and I didn't have a good, I used to have a pen that was a marking pen that was a disappearing marking pen for fabric, and I don't have that anymore, and I can't find my white chalk. And that blue pencil was also not marking very well, but that is what I tried to use, the blue pencil. And with the buttonholes done, I was able to sew all four sides together now. And when I turned it, I found there were some places where the sewing hadn't worked, where I lost stitches. And there were some places where I didn't like the depth of the welt or piping. So what I did was I just adjusted that by hand. It is actually not that difficult to sew even several layers of this vinyl by hand. You just might need to use a thimble now and then to push it through, but it really wasn't too bad. So I am concerned about putting the bottom on again because I'm just not that good at sewing. And I feel like I want the bottom to have piping or a welt. And I definitely don't have anything long enough to go all the way around the bottom. So I'm going to have to join some pieces of vinyl together to make a nice long cord that I can put around the bottom piece before I attach it to the rest. Also trying to figure out what do I do with the piping that's at the bottom, and what I decided to do was press it down flat right at the bottom and stitch across it. So we have a few things we need to do. We need to press all of those cords or piping down at the bottom of the bag and stitch them flat, and we need to assemble a nice long piece of the vinyl that is 1 inch wide that will go all the way around the bottom, and then we need to stitch that to the bottom, and then we need to stitch the bottom to our bag. But at that point, all we'll have to do is basically add the lining and then do the cord and stitch the lining to the top so that the cord will cinch the bag. So to put these pieces together to make the nice long cord, I cut them on the diagonal, and then you stitch them together. You can see from the, I don't know how to describe that, from the corner to the corner. So where it overlaps, that's where you're going to stitch it, and then you cut off those triangular pieces. So there it is. And then we're just going to stitch it to the bottom, and then stitch the bottom of the bag to the 4 sides of the bag. Okay, so once I'd done that stitching, I was not able to get those corners to sew on my machine. So I did sew all of those corners by hand. I sewed the middle parts on the machine because that worked just fine. But then I turned the bag inside out and I sewed all the corners by hand. And again, it really wasn't that difficult. If you don't mind sitting in front of the television set or something else and sewing, it's really not a big deal. But I wasn't able to do it on my machine. And I am going to sew these crossbody straps together. Now, how are those going to attach to the bag? Well, here's how they're going to cinch the bag and stay closed when the bag is cinched, is with these 2 rings. And I purchased these rings at Amazon, but there are Dollar Tree alternatives. And this works quite well with the unfinished crossbody strap. It slides really easily. It does not once I finish the straps. I want that to connect there, and I completely forgot to leave that open and put something in there for that to connect to. So we're going to have to open that up. There, you can see how easily it slides. Oh well, the best laid plans. Maybe I should have left it unfinished. So the lining is pretty straightforward to sew together because we're basically just making a box or a lunch bag. We're just going to sew the sides to the front and then to the back, and then we'll sew the bottom on. We are going to leave an opening in the bottom. So I stitched 2 sides and I left 2 sides open because what we're going to do is put the lining on outside, like a little glove, outside the bag, stitch the top, and then just pull it over and turn it to the inside. Okay, so here's my hand stitching. Really wasn't that difficult. And here's where we need to connect something. So what I'm going to use is a ring and one of the original hand straps. Sort of fold that over and put it in there so that it's on the outside. Here we're showing it on the inside, but it's going to be on the outside so that the other strap can just actually be sewn around it. Okay, so that's sewn on now. So there's a ring that we're going to attach the strap to. And we also want to put the bag tag on now because we're going to be doing the lining. And once we do the lining, we won't have access to the other side of these front pieces. So push that through, make sure it looks decent, and then you just fold these prongs down, so it couldn't be easier. I don't know if you'd want to do something additional. One thing that might bother me is that I've just cut that fabric, so maybe some fabric glue or something to prevent it from fraying. It does have the interfacing on it, so I wasn't too worried. And it's covered by the vinyl, but it's a consideration. So when we attach the lining, we are going to have the bag right side out. And any little holes that I might find here, I can't remember if I do or not, I will have sewn them up again by hand before I complete the lining. So this may be the first time that I'm turning it right side out, and I may have found, in fact I'm pretty sure I did find that there were some places where I hadn't gotten it perfect, but you're not allowed to see. Now you can see it a little bit. So I just fixed that up before I put the lining on. Fixed all the parts where it was coming open, and we'll take the lining and we put that on the outside of the bag. So right side's facing. So we're looking at the wrong side of the lining. And we just want to try to line up the pieces as best we can. Now, because I wasn't true to that 1/2 inch seam allowance, they're not lining up perfectly, but it's fine. It's a stretchy fabric. So we're just going to sew a little seam around the top. That seam sewn. Just turn it, and I left plenty of space for that. Stuff it in. What you would do is now sew this closed by hand. I haven't done that because I'm going to do it last. And at this point, I sort of debated whether I liked that lining on the outside, but I decided to go with my original plan. And what we need to do is stitch that down on the outside with a decorative stitch, and then we need to stitch around the bottom of that top piece of vinyl. Now see, it kind of looks cute, but no. I don't know, what do you think? Should I have done it the other way? I could have had it just cinch with the lining. So I could have sewn around the lining, top and bottom, just wide enough to put the cord through. Now I had trouble with this sewing again because of the thickness of the fabric right there at the corners. I was able to sew in the middle but not at the corners, and so what I did end up doing was sewing it well enough on the machine that I could thread the cord through, or the straps through, and cinch it, but I wasn't happy with the way it looked. So I did stitch the top by hand, both at the top there and down at the bottom of that top piece of vinyl. And that did take a good amount of time because I was trying to be very careful with the sewing to make it look decent. But it looked better sewn by hand than it had looked sewn on the machine. It was more noticeable. I doubled up my thread to sew it, so I thought it looked pretty good. But for now, we're going to go for the sewing machine, see how we do. The advantage to doing it on the sewing machine first is it gives you a nice line, a nice straight line to follow for when you sew it by hand. So there it is sewn, and now I'm going to work with the strap. So top and bottom, and I will fix all that when I sew it by hand. And I chose to sew it first and then thread the strap through, versus putting the strap in and then sewing around it, because I figured with my sewing ability I'd sew over the strap and sew it to the bag, and that would be a big mess. So I thought a few moments of torture trying to thread this thing through, and it's not that bad. It starts off really easy, but I figured that that was worth it versus me probably making a mistake and sewing it into the bag and then it wouldn't work. So the only thing we have left to do now, besides hand stitch around the top, because it doesn't look that great the way it is now, is to attach it to that ring at the bottom. First we need to put the 2 rings on. We need to get the straps even, put the 2 rings on, and then we're just going to sew it around that ring at the bottom. Okay, so with the ring at the bottom, what I decided to do was rip the seams a little bit at the bottom and cut a piece off of each of those pieces, so like the bottom of the top piece is under the top of the bottom piece, and then I sew them together along their original seams, and I also do a zigzag stitch. And here's the finished bag. I'm pretty pleased with it. I think I'm actually going to use it. I'm a little worried about the white, but I'm going to try to use this bag because I think it's very cute. Well, what I mean is I'm going to try to use it without getting it dirty because I do think it's really cute. I really like it. I'm really pleased with how this bag came out. It looks basically how I had planned, and I'm not that good at sewing, so that was a real surprise for me. One thing that I'm particularly happy about is that the white lines up all the way around, because I was worried about that. I did do it very slowly and carefully. It took me the better part of a day just to create the bag, and it took me an evening to do the hand stitching that I did on the top. So I did spend a lot of time on it. One thing that I thought of while I was working on was that maybe we could put a pocket on the front here, and then I forgot about that idea. But I think we did have enough vinyl left over to do that. One part that doesn't work as well as I had hoped is using these rings to open and close the bag. And that's because I tried it on the crossbody strap that was unfinished on one side, and it slid very easily, but it does not slide easily on these straps, which are finished on both sides. If you made this bag, I would love to hear about it in the comments below. If you use different fabrics or different vinyl, if you did have some innovations like putting a pocket on the front, I would love to hear about them. And also, of course, if you have suggestions for me for improving any of my techniques or for styling a bag in a different way, I'd love to hear about them. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up. And if you like this sort of content, please consider subscribing to Crafts the Charm. Thank you for spending time with me today. Take care.